Pay close attention to what you are about to see. These images will be seen around the world. These rats have been fed with transgenic corn during their entire life cycle. The tumors they suffer from are enormous. The study that revealed the effect of the GMOs on the health of these rats has just been completed. It benefited from exceptional financial and technical means. We were able to witness the study in its entirety. It lasted for 2 years. Following years of doubt and controversies, will we finally know the truth about GMOs? Would we then be faced with a health crisis of global proportions?
This is the longest, most thorough study to have been carried out on a GMO, and we have also carried out a joint study on the most used pesticide in the world, the Roundup, which is a herbicide. It belongs to the main pesticide category. We spent over a year trying to obtain transgenic corn because no GMO manufacturers were willing to provide them. This is because Monsanto requires contracts to be signed stipulating that the seeds must not be used for testing and an arrangement must be made prior to the testing. We wanted our study to be independent.
This is the first time that a 2-year study has been conducted on GMOs. And there lies the big difference. Furthermore, we tried to evaluate a maximum of biochemical and biological parameters with repeated blood tests, weighing of the specimens, and urine tests. We studied the hepatic and urinary parameters, as well as the blood parameters, all the parameters that can be studied. We also studied the hormonal parameters, which has never been done in previous studies. This experiment is a world premiere.
Up until now, the corn NK603, the very one selected for the study, had only been tested over a 3-month period, and that in a test environment entirely controlled by Monsanto, its manufacturer. Furthermore, concerning the Roundup, also manufactured by Monsanto and which is used for growing corn, only its active agent, glyphosate, had been assessed. But one needs to understand that the manufacturers, in order to enable the active agent to penetrate the plant cell successfully, use additives that are sometimes more harmful than the actual glyphosate.
We have 2 clear objectives. Firstly, to conduct the studies exactly according to international requirements, but making sure to be very thorough when it comes to analyzing the results. Secondly, we want to determine if there are secondary effects. The only way to do this is to carry out tests on animals and then to examine all the blood parameters whilst paying close attention to their organs.
At this stage, it might prove useful to know exactly what GMOs are used for. It is a plant that has been developed either to produce its own insecticide or to be tolerant to a herbicide, thus enabling it to be exposed to massive doses of it without dying. One can understand how GMOs could be useful to farmers. For example, they would be able to spray their entire field with Roundup, killing all the weeds in the process and never harming the genetically modified plant. On the other hand, it is hard to see the benefits for the consumer, who will effectively be ingesting substances coming from a plant that has absorbed pesticides. That is why it is crucial to test not only the GMO, but also the GMO with its residue and the pesticide on its own.
This type of testing had never been done before because the corporations doing the tests would do them on GMOs with the Roundup, which meant that we had no idea what between the GMO and the Roundup caused the pathologies, or they did them on GMOs without specifying that this was the case. So what we decided to do was to address the question, are we dealing with the effects of the GMO or the pesticide? During the last 10 years of testing, the National Commission did not envisage a pesticide effect.
Therefore, Europe does not even demand that chronicle toxicity tests be systematically carried out on animals, and when they are required, it is the manufacturers who decide the protocol to be used. For example, the Amflora potato was only tested on a group of 30 rats, 10 of which were being fed the GMO. The Monsanto corn was tested on 400 rats. 80 of them were fed the transgenic plant, but only 40 of them were then subjected to blood tests. Either way, none of these studies lasted longer than 90 days.
What is represented by this figure is that certain groups of rats, male and female, have ingested GMO corn. GMO corn with Roundup residue and Roundup on its own. Every time we go up a level, a rat dies. The limit is 10 due to the number of rats that constitute a group. The dotted line represents the females of the group who die but have a completely normal diet. Only 2 animals die spontaneously after 550 days. On the other hand, every female that has been fed on the GMO with Roundup or Roundup diet has died more frequently than the other rats. Some will challenge the relevance of such results, but what is undeniable is that in the group that has been exposed to the GMOs, there is a 600% increase or 6 times more deaths compared to the control group. As far as medicine or biology is concerned, there is no need for further testing.
An important fact is that all the studies carried out on the rats are done over a 3-month period. It so happens that none of the effects are visible until the 4th month. This is fundamental in understanding that studies conducted over a 3-month period are useless. This conclusion is easily understandable. It could be said that their only use is to soothe the consciences
Every rat out of the 200 that were tested was dissected by Professor Seralini's team. They did this to discover exactly what had affected their organs. The purpose behind this was to identify the way each diet, GMO and Roundup on its own, had acted on the metabolism of each animal, focusing on the development rate of the tumors that, and this comes as no surprise, only start to manifest themselves after the initial 3-month period.
This figure represents the number of palpable tumors contracted by the animal during the experiment. Here, we can see the rats subjected to GMOs compared to those with a regular diet. As you can see, very few males have contracted tumors. This is due to them being more resistant to the testing process. What these figures show are the large tumors. Each step up represents a large tumor, which can measure 17 millimeters by 17 millimeters. For a rat, these measurements are colossal. It would equate to a tumor of this size if seen on a human being. It is enormous. After having studied these tumors, it can be said that 94% of them take effect in the mammary glands, which would equate to breast cancer in a woman. We are faced with renal tumors for the males, but not only, some males also suffer from mammary tumors. This points towards a hormonal effect that isn't affected by the dosage. 60% of breast cancer cases are caused by hormonal deficiencies.
Professor Seralini's study holds one last surprise for us, and this is a major one. Up until now, one could have thought that the main cause of death for the tested rats was coming from the pesticide added to the corn. But what the study highlighted, and this for the first time ever, is the fact that the transgenesis itself could have killed the rats. What this means is that just by interfering with the genome of the plant in order to modify it, we are faced with repercussions that no one could have anticipated. This is enough to make us reconsider all the scientific precepts that led to the creation of GMOs.
Roundup had never been tested separately. Whilst conducting cellular studies, we saw that the cells of the liver, embryos, kidneys, placenta and the umbilical cord died much faster, and so we could deduce that there was a toxic effect on the organism. What can be said is that there is an increase in deaths due to GMOs and Roundups. The biggest surprise came when we realized that GMOs without any Roundup residue were responsible for an increase in the death rate of females and of some males. This could be the result of the GMO gene that has been badly assimilated by the plant and that has therefore resulted in a negative effect or due to a secondary metabolical effect.
What that means is that we are dealing with a GMO in particular. a modification of a cereal or a GMO corn, with regard to the genes inserted in the corn to make it a GMO corn, can result in different effects. It is not because a certain GMO has a particular effect that other GMOs will have an effect, but some may even have more of an impact.
What is alarming, this is the GMO that is being eaten by the Americans, but also the GMO that has been approved for importation by European agencies, including the French ones, and that obviously contaminates our food.
Nowadays, only 2 types of GMOs are being produced in a few European countries. One is corn and the other potato. But what about the 27 million tons of transgenic soya that are unloaded each year in European ports? This soya is used to feed our cattle, but it also makes its way into a number of foodstuffs.
What we want to achieve with this study is a moratorium. The situation is serious enough, and we're not going to eat everything and anything. We imported without knowing what was being imported, and the United States have produced crops without knowing what they were producing. There needs to be more studies of this kind, and GMO manufacturers need to conduct them before commercializing their products.
A moratorium on growing GMOs has been approved by most European countries. Now that we know the results of the study conducted by Professor Seralini, could it be time to extend this moratorium to all the GMO used in many of our foods? To establish an undeniable scientific truth, one needs teams, time, and means. Some will say that it takes too much time and that it is too expensive. But had we taken this precaution, could we not have avoided recent sanitary scandals? Will GMOs be responsible yet again for a calamitous scenario? And while we are waiting for scientific certainties, evidently, this is a risk we cannot afford to take.
What does the research show when we look at what has been done to see just how dangerous these GMO foods are? Well, there's 2 parts to this research. One is the herbicides. Is the toxicity or the cancers that we're seeing due to the excess herbicides that's being used, or is it the genetically modified component of the plant itself? So what they did, they took some animals, usually rats or mice, and they would feed them a diet that consisted of about 11 to 33% GMO corn for 2 years. Now the lifespan of a rat or a mouse is about 2.5 to 3 years. So what we're doing is seeing a lifetime study. What happens when you consume GMO-type foods for an entire lifetime? And that's what we want to know. Well, they used control animals in which they fed natural corn, the non-GMO, and what they found is that if you feed animals a natural food, once they reach that 2 years limit, which would be in a human toward middle age, about 20% of the females will die and about 30% of the males will die. That's just their natural death rate. But if the animals are eating GMO corn, we see something very frightening. The death rate in the males more than doubles. It's 50%. And in the females, it's 70%. So we see almost a 2.5 times increase in death rate in both males and females consuming this GMO food. Most shocking is that these animals were dying prematurely even when they were eating the lower dose GMO food. So it's not a dose-related thing. A lot of toxins may not be that toxic if you're consuming a lower dose, only if you're consuming the higher dose. But here we found out even consuming the lower dose, they had premature death. The females that consumed the GMO diet died about at age 21 months. And the death rate was 6 times higher than those that were eating the normal diet. So it's a direct effect of the GMO gene insertion itself. The females were dying of breast tumors, and the males were dying of kidney damage. We explained that GMO can cause tumors. And the study in which they were feeding the animals the GMO foods, about 33%, in their diet, which is equal to a human diet, when they fed them the low dose, they found that the females were producing these very malignant tumors. The ironic thing was that the size of the tumor, and these were massive breast cancers, the size of the tumor was not related to the dose. That is, a low dose produced just as many of these giant tumors as did the higher dose. So it's not dose related. The tumors occurred in females 5 times more often than the males. So it tends to occur in both. In other words, you'll see some males will develop breast cancer from it, but mainly it's occurring in the females. 90% of all tumors in the females were breast cancers, even though there were some other types of cancers. For instance, there were ovarian cancers in some of the females and skin cancers in both males and females. The tumors were unusual in that they were so enormous. I mean, these tumors were almost the size of the animal itself, and they grew so rapidly, became highly invasive type of tumors. This is quite unusual in agents that causes cancers. Interestingly, the majority of these tumors appeared after 18 months of feeding this GMO diet, which is important because the World Health Organization sets the study time at 90 days. That is, you watch the animal for 90 days, and if they seem to be healthy or if they get sick, you don't look at it after 90 days. Well, none of the animals developed any tumors within that period. They all developed them at 18 months or later. The earliest tumor was seen at 4 months, well beyond the 3-month limit set by the World Health Organization. So when you read articles, for instance, in scientific journals which said, well, we didn't find that, well, they stopped the study at that 3-month period. When you want to consider, well, how important is this to me? What is my chance of being exposed to these GMO crops? Well, 75% of all corn grown in the United States, for instance, is GMO-type corn. Many foods use corn ingredients, maltodextrin, corn sugars, corn flour, etc. The onset of the tumors in humans also would occur at a period that's equal to 18 months in a mouse, which is middle age in humans. So if humans are consuming this, say, from birth or from early in life, you wouldn't expect these massive tumors or rapid growing tumors to appear into middle age. Well, most of the people that's been eating these GMO foods in the world have not reached that point yet. So this is something we're going to see in the future, the very near future, whether or not there's going to be an explosion of breast cancers, ovarian cancers, and certain skin cancers. Essentially, we have not been eating this GMO food long enough to see these effects.
We'll get back to Dr. Blaylock in just one moment, but I wanted to emphasize a very important point. GMO crops have been genetically modified to tolerate much higher doses of herbicides and pesticides without harming the plants. And the reason is this ensures a larger yield for the farmer. But if the animal studies are any indication, these toxic chemicals, especially in these larger quantities, pose a serious health threat to consumers who eat GMO foods. Let me be clear on this. Before GMO foods were invented in the laboratory, the herbicides and pesticides had to be used sparingly or they would harm the plants. But then scientists genetically modified the plants so they would not be hurt by these larger doses of herbicides and pesticides. And conveniently, the GMO seed companies also make and sell the chemicals sprayed on the GMO crops. Now, that may be good for GMO companies and large growers, but what about your health? The health of your family, the health of your children. Let me demonstrate. This is one of the most commonly used pesticides on the market. And here are just a few popular corn products: chips, cereal, popcorn. Okay, we know 75% of all corn crops in the U.S. today are genetically modified GMOs, which means they use higher quantities of herbicides and pesticides on them. So let's add the pesticide. Would you eat these foods? Would you serve them to your family, to your children? The answer is an obvious no. Of course not.
Scientist who discovered GMOs cause tumors in rats wins landmark defamation lawsuit in Paris, November 30th, 2015. Was French professor Gilles Seralini correct when he discovered that scientific feeding experiments past 90 days with GMO foods in rats can cause serious health problems, including tumors? The answer to that question has been debated ever since the initial publication of his study, culminating in a republication of the study in another peer-reviewed journal that wasn't nearly as well covered as the initial retraction was by the mainstream media. Now, Professor Seralini is in the news again, this time for winning a major court victory in a libel trial that represents the second court victory for Seralini and his team in less than a month. All right, what on earth is this all about? For those who are joining this story in medias res, this is Professor Gilles Seralini, who published a landmark feeding study regarding GMO corn and Roundup Ready herbicide in 2012 in an article in the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology. Now, the details of that study and how it came to be retracted are in this video, this eye-opener report that I did in December of 2013 called Genetic Fallacy: How Monsanto Silences Scientific Dissent. Of course, this is going to be linked up in the show notes. Please go and watch this video if you don't know about this trial or about this study and then its subsequent retraction and why that retraction is, well, was bogus. This is a very important report, and I'm not just blowing my own horn here. This is a report that actually won a Project Censored Award last year. I never really mentioned that, so you might not know it, but yes, this is, I think, one of my most important reports on this subject, so I hope you will go and take a look. Of course, the transcript of this is also up on my website under Genetic Fallacy, so let's just read a little bit about this study, Long-Term Toxicity of a Roundup Herbicide and a Roundup-Tolerant Genetically Modified Maize. The researchers followed 200 rats over 2 years, divided into 10 groups each of 10 males and 10 females. 3 of the groups were fed Monsanto's patented NK603 GMO corn alone. 3 groups were fed the corn treated with Roundup herbicide, 3 groups were fed Roundup treated water but no GMO corn, and a control group was fed neither GMO corn nor Roundup herbicide. The team's results indicated that the rats fed the Roundup or the GMO corn, separately or combined, were more likely to experience a range of ill health effects than the non-GMO control group. Tellingly, the adverse health effects did not start to appear until the 4th month of the study, while a previous industry-sponsored feeding trial on the same corn variety only lasted 3 months. That study did find signs of toxicity as well, but these results were dismissed as not biologically meaningful. All right, I'll let you continue reading about how ultimately this study came under immediate fire from the usual suspects in the industry-funded lobby groups, and ultimately the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology retracted the study, but not retracted it based on its own published guidelines for its principles for retraction, i.e. clear evidence that the findings are unreliable due to misconduct or error, plagiarism or redundant publication, or unethical research. No, none of those. They came up with a new criteria. Mainly, they found that no evidence of fraud or intentional misrepresentation of the data, and the results presented were correct, or not incorrect, but were inconclusive. So on the basis of inconclusiveness, they retracted that study, which again is a double standard, as I go on to note, that is only applicable apparently to critics of the GMO industry in general and Monsanto products in particular. And there's a specific part of that accusation in regards to this. Again, in that video, Genetic Fallacy, I play a clip of Dr. E. Ann Clark talking about how the journal in question that retracted this study happened to appoint a Monsanto a lobbyist on their board during the time of the retraction. So again, so much to this, but ultimately this goes back to the question of whether or not the science itself was acceptable. And basically critics of the study argue, well, those rats are prone to those types of tumors, so they're not good for this type of study and blah, blah, blah. But this still represents fundamentally a double standard used in evaluating GMO safety studies. And the pro-GMO industry can get away with inconclusive studies as long as they are on the GMO industry side. But as soon as an independent scientist tries to do the exact same type of study, the exact same setup, well, if they have results that are the same as the GMO-funded studies, they get retracted, like Seralini. So this story comes from InScienceCensorship.org. which says, an example of an inconclusive study that has not been retracted from FCT, the Food and Chemical Toxicology Journal, is the Monsanto study on the same GM maize variety that Seralini tested. This study used the same strain of rat and analyzed blood and urine samples from the same number of animals as Seralini used in total. Crucially, however, the Monsanto study was only 90 days in duration. Thus, it was terminated a month before the more obvious pathologies began to appear in the Seralini study. Nevertheless, the data in the Monsanto study show statistically significant differences in multiple organ functions between the GM and non-GM feeding groups, which the Monsanto authors dismissed as not biologically meaningful without proper scientific justification. As a result, and of great importance from a public health perspective, this GM maize was passed by regulators as safe to consume on a lifelong basis, despite the fact that the Monsanto study was only 90 days in duration and contained scientifically questionable claims of statistically significant findings being termed as not biologically meaningful. In fact, the Monsanto data as presented are inconclusive. Applying the same criteria to the Monsanto study as were used to evaluate and retract the Seralini study, the Monsanto paper should also be retracted, as it was too inconclusive in its findings. Again, I mean, just blatant double standards going on, and I'll let you read through all of that. But the point of all of this is that although the Food and Chemical Toxicology Journal did retract the study, it was republished in another peer-reviewed journal, this time the Environmental Sciences Europe journal. So, again, this was republished with an addendum of comments regarding the criticisms of the first study. So that is there. It's an open access journal, so you can access this freely and read through it yourself. And I suggest you do so. But as this article pointed out, somehow, for some reason, the republication of this study in the peer-reviewed literature did not seem to get any traction in the mainstream media, although the initial retraction of this study got a lot of attention in the MSM. Oh, look, this crazy anti-GMO scientist with his vendetta against GMOs, his study has been retracted for bad science. Well, of course, again, when you look into it, it's a ridiculous claim, and then it was republished anyway, but you never heard about that. Well, now he has won a couple of court cases on this. The first one that they note here in this article, on November 25th, the High Court in Paris indicted Marc Fallus, the former chairman of France's Biomolecular Energy Commission, for forgery and use of forgery. And according to Seralini, this relates to the signature of a scientist whose name was used without his agreement to argue that Seralini and his coworkers were wrong in their studies on Monsanto products, including GM corn. So basically, this Biomolecular Engineering Commission chair for France slandered Seralini using a forged name of a scientist. He is expected to be sentenced for that crime in June of 2016. And this is the second court case that Seralini has won in the last month. The other one, you can find details here. Seralini's team wins defamation and forgery court cases on GMO and pesticide research. It notes that in September 2012, an article written by Jean-Claude Jaillet in Marianne magazine said that researchers around the world had voiced harsh words about the research of Seralini and his team on the toxic effects of a GMO and Roundup over a long-term period, research that was supported by the independent organization CREGEN. The journalist wrote of a scientific fraud in which the methodology served to reinforce predetermined results. But Seralini and his team and CREGEN challenged this allegation in a defamation lawsuit. They were assisted by notaries, blah, blah, blah. On 6th of November 2015, after a criminal investigation lasting 3 years, the 17th Criminal Chamber of the High Court of Paris passed sentence. Marianne magazine and its journalist were fined for public defamation of a public official and public defamation of the researchers and of CREGEN. So, some court successes going on here, defending Seralini and his name and reputation, but perhaps too little too late, because in the minds of many who heard anything at all about this study, they probably only heard that it was retracted and thus not really that important. Well, that is a lie. It is being shown and demonstrated to be a lie, but not in the MSM, that of course is not going to publish things that are in opposition to their cushy advertising dollars from their Monsanto clients. No, it's up to us to continue to get the word out about this. So there's lots of information here that, again, I'll put in the show notes. Please do start with this genetic fallacy video and work your way out from there. And if you know about all this information, excellent. But as always, I guarantee you there are people in your life who do not. And if you bring up something like this feeding study showing these tumors in these rats, you're probably going to be confronted with people saying, oh, that study was retracted. Well, you can use this information to show those naysayers in your life why they are wrong. And hopefully we can continue to learn our way forward in all of this. Again, this is an exceptionally important story, and it goes to the heart of the types of scientific frauds that are perpetrated with the aid of various organizations that don't want the truth coming out. We are here to help that truth get out. So you are part of that fight. Please help spread this information. James Corbett, CorbettReport.com.